Welcome everybody. Just going to wait for a few more people. We can see the participants coming in thick and fast now. So we'll kick off in just a minute when it ticks over to the hour. But we can already see some familiar faces joining us today. So great to see you back, and welcome to anyone who hasn't attended one of these sessions before. Just kind of quick housekeeping thing. This might be showing as an hour-long session for some people, but will be done in around 30 minutes. So if that is the case, you'll get some time back. But yeah, today we're going to be talking about the importance of data, how it can be leveraged, and how Elucidat's analytics functionality can support this. But before we kind of get started in earnest, maybe you could just take a quick look at the question that's going to be on the slide in just a moment, and you can share your own experiences in the chat. And we'll leave that up for just a moment so everyone gets a chance to see it. And then we'll move on, do a couple of quick intros and get going.
I'm having to go as well at answering it in the chat, Will.
Yeah, should have prepared.
Oh, apart from, I don't think I post that to everyone. So don't be scared, everybody. You can use the chat. We're a friendly bunch, and yeah, encourage you to come up with any ideas that you've got. Perhaps you haven't had a chance to really get to use data yet. So, you know, it could be an ambition if you haven't yet managed to use it. We'll come back to this question later as well.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay, should we move on to the intros? Perfect. Okay, so yeah, it's great to meet you, everyone. My name is Will Brown. I head up the learning consultancy team here at Elucidat. So in a nutshell, we support Elucidat customers with their L&D priorities, whether that's upskilling people internally to create more impactful content, creating things like templates and brand styles, or providing a kind of agency style service and doing full design and builds of gold standard e-learning courses for our customers. And then joining me today, I've got Kirstie Greany.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, Kirstie Greany here. So head of learning strategy at Elucidat. Like Will, I've got a background in learning consultancy and have been working in L&D for 20 plus years, a bit way too long now. But yeah, at Elucidat, then I try to bring people together, learn about what everyone's struggling with, try and get everybody to help each other and share advice and best practice back out there with our customers and beyond as well. So that's a great role to have as well. So I get to meet a lot of you and talk with a lot of you as well.
Fantastic. Okay, so before we get started, I thought it'd be useful to just define a couple of terms. So we're going to be talking about macro data and micro data. So when we're talking about the macro data, we're talking about things that are kind of tangible signs of genuine behavior change and performance improvement. So how are we kind of moving the needle in different areas? The macro data is those kind of wider measures of success. So have reports of data breaches reduced or increased, depending on what you're trying to achieve, have sales numbers increased, have customer satisfaction scores increased. It's that real return on investment that's so important to the business. And then the other type of data we're looking at is the micro data. This is probably the stuff that people in L&D have been more familiar with traditionally. So thinking about that e-learning and LMS data. So data about users and usage, things like how are people answering questions, what are the drop-off rates, people's assessment scores, completion rates, and things like that. So we'll be talking about both of these types of data in more detail throughout the session at various points. So I'm sure everybody on the call today is all too aware of the technological sea change that we're seeing at the moment. And this means that now, more than ever before, every part of every business needs to be really confident that it's delivering that ROI. So for L&D, we've got to consider a number of things from AI to personalization, immersive learning, all of which are really changing the learning landscape. And we need to feel confident that we're keeping up with what's working but also confident that we're in a really good position to be experimenting and trying new things. So we can kind of really be pushing the boundaries of the impact we're able to have on our organizations. The broader economic conditions are also, they also kind of loom large, and it means that budgets are under heavy scrutiny, and all of us in L&D teams need to prove the impact we're having in order to secure the budgets that are going to enable us to operate at a really high level and kind of drive that impact. And then finally, you've probably heard a lot of talk about skills-based organizations, but these skills-first strategies are on the rise, and this means there's a real onus on us to measure learning's role and how we're actually closing these skills gaps. So all of this means that kind of being a data-driven L&D function, or not being a data-driven L&D function rather, is just not really an option anymore. Teams need to kind of move beyond those traditional measures of just completion rates to real performance metrics. So thinking about what we can demonstrate to our leaders, right up to C-suite who are paying close attention to this stuff, and prove to them how we're helping to close the skills gaps across our organizations.
Brilliant. Thanks, Will. So apologies, everybody. I've just realised the chat was disabled, even though I actually ticked the box this time to put it on. It wasn't working. So I could see some of you using Q&A to let us know. So you can all chat now, and maybe we can test it out because we've got a question coming up. So yeah, hi, Colin. Thanks. So a question I'd like to throw out there, and one that I've been looking into and doing some research around, is what do you think are the key challenges or blockers that L&D teams tend to have with measuring impact? Because let's not pretend it's easy. So what do you think gets in the way or makes it hard? If you can use the chat to throw in some answers, and then I'll share what I've been finding. I'll give you a moment to have a think. What gets in your way? Understanding what's available and how to interpret it, yeah. Platform and time to gather data around behavioural change. Okay, so getting to that level, that's really important. Difficult to estimate the impact. Yeah, it's not always obvious. So lack of access to data has come up again, yeah. So these are common threads. So quite often what we hear is that data can be in multiple places. It can be difficult sometimes to make the connection between the learning and, for example, the behaviour outcome, when other things might be part of the picture, for example. So you don't get magic insights just because you have data. You have to kind of work out what the data might be telling you and how to draw insights. And not everybody feels they've got skills to do that. Some of the other things that I heard when I was chatting to learning managers was that sometimes it felt like nobody was really asking for it as well. So a lot of L&D teams can report on scores and completions, but they're not always getting asked for more. So maybe they don't feel like they need to invest the time or want to invest the time to go and explore that. So on the flip side of that, we went out and we talked to team leaders, so not in L&D, but business leaders that run departments. So we talk to people who are in HR and they might run onboarding, for example. We talk to people who work in product teams, and we talk to people who worked in sales teams. So sometimes those teams create their own learning. It doesn't always go through L&D. And what we actually discovered by talking to them is we uncovered what metrics they actually use on a day-to-day or weekly basis or quarterly basis, but also what measures they would do for their own learning if they produced it themselves. And it was quite telling. So I thought I'd share some of those metrics with you because it could give you some signals for the sorts of things that you might want to drill into at that kind of macro level. So some of this you might know. So onboarding metrics, then quite a common one that people who are in charge of onboarding within organisations will look at retention, because obviously we know that nobody wants people to leave, especially not early on. The cost of that is very high to businesses and you lose a lot of talent. So what percentage of people are leaving within, for example, 30 to 90 days or in that first year? Employee engagement is really important to people for onboarding. So often there's things like NPS used, feedback around the onboarding, and time to productivity, slightly harder to measure, but there can be performance reviews that say like 90 days, or there could be set periods of time where you want somebody to be able to ramp up and be able to do that job. So how quickly can somebody go and stack the shelves in a supermarket? How quickly can people make their first sales call? So when it comes to them doing their own training, they, for example, those who run onboarding shared that they might look at attrition rates in year one, for example. So after doing the new onboarding, what percentage of new hires who took it, passed their probation and stayed beyond that year. how many might be willing to recommend that learning to other people. That's where NPS comes in. And again, that time to first key task. So how soon does a new hire complete a first task after they've done the learning? So it's correlative data. So you're looking at who's done the learning and what impact did that have on the metrics that they track anyway. So sometimes in L&D, we can feel like we need to start again with data or somehow magic up a dashboard from thin air. But actually, if you talk to the teams that you're doing the training for, often they have metrics already. So in product, we have a product team, but we also spoke to product teams out there in enterprise organizations. So they will be looking at customer engagement, for example. So the percentage of their target audience that get interested in that product. The revenue uplift, what are the sales of that new product is if it has a price tag with it. And it could also look at metrics like the resolution of product-related issues. So how quickly or how well can support teams answer the questions to customers about that product? So there's more metrics that they shared, but just to give you an example, and when they do their own training, they might, for example, dive into manager or peer feedback on kind of customer calls to check if the scripts are being followed. So there's lots of tools that record customer calls, for examples, or it could be observing actual conversations in stores to check they're kind of accurate and aligned with the training that they've had. It could be about message retention as well. So actually it's quite important for product and sales as well that you've retained the messages 10, 20, 40 days later, and you're still, if you like, sticking to the facts that you've been told about that product. So we've got a question to ask, haven't we? I think this is over to you, Will.
Yeah, so well, it's actually over to the audience really. So thinking back to that example we've just shown, kind of what would this look like for some sales training? So kind of what metrics might sales teams track, and then what might they track for their training? So I'll give you just a moment to kind of have a think about that, and then we'll share some of the answers we had.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh.
to a signed contract. Fantastic, thank you.
So I mean, I'm waiting for the big one because I think sales has an obvious one that is often about money, right? How much money is generated? Yeah, profit increase. There we go.
The conversion rates, revenue. Yeah. Yeah, see with sales, it is slightly more obvious than other areas because you have that bottom line, which is, very kind of clear for everyone to see, very clear to target people on, very clear to measure. So thinking about kind of then what they'd be tracking for their training in order to impact those numbers. So yeah, you've all very rightly pointed out that there's the kind of transaction times and efficiency piece. So has that training helped sales teams to work more efficiently? One of the other ones that we highlighted was sales outreach effectiveness. So are the sales reps engaging more customers and generating more leads through those conversations? And then, yeah, the revenue growth and sales uplift. So are the trained employees selling more or closing more deals, as you all highlighted? So thinking then about what people track for the training in relation to those metrics, we could look at sales performance in the first 90 days after the training. So has the velocity of deals improved? We could be thinking about assessment scores in retention tests. So if we're saying retaining this key messaging around the products is super important to increasing sales, you can maybe roll out a kind of spaced practice or spaced assessment strategy where we're saying, okay, how well are people maintaining that understanding and retaining those key messages? And then the final one's really just about, that sales performance. So say in the first 90 days after the training, how effectively are people selling? And you might even think about maybe comparing the results of a cohort that has done the training versus one that hasn't to see if you can notice a kind of real correlation between those who have done the training and improved results. So all of these data points are going to tell you so much more than just completion rates, which are still often tracked but aren't a really strong indicator of impact or change. We also just wanted to really quickly go back to this kind of tried and tested methodology of starting with a clear goal. So starting with the end in mind. So what are you trying to change? And the capture guide, which the screen grabs on the slide are from, is a free resource that are going to help you to do this. But however you're approaching your design, just remember to begin with that business problem you're trying to solve. or perhaps it's an opportunity you're looking to seize, and really ensuring that you've got this in mind right from the outset and asking yourself, how can we benchmark that now? And then how can we track progress against the metric or metrics that you identify as really important?
Brilliant, thanks. So shortly we're going to start diving into looking at some micro data. So at the minute we're still talking about those macro measures, the sorts of ones that you'd put in front of your business leaders to show that you've added value. But before we do, we've got another question. So we've asked you about sales training, but what about something that was around delegation for leaders? Now, we're cheating here because obviously in real life, you would go and talk to those stakeholders. You're probably going to talk to people to identify what sort of metric would be useful to track, like what's the training about. But anyone got any thoughts as to what you could measure? Could be at a macro level or a micro level for something around delegation, for some training around delegation. It's a bit of a tricky one. So yeah, okay, Sebastian's got an idea here. So use things like to-do apps or project management to see how many tasks the manager assigns. I like that. That's a very, very practical one. So that's really good. Completion of jobs, yeah. Fantastic. So productivity angle, that's a good way to put it. I like those ideas. We've got some other ones as well. So productivity ones are great to see because I don't think that we've got those on our actual slides. So that's great. So that complements those. So it could be, yeah, you could look at performance metrics, whether it's the number of jobs delegated, but it could be like, is the performance in a certain team improving? So you could look at productivity, or performance might be also around like the quality, for example, of what's being done in that team. There could be some metrics, for example, around leader engagement and satisfaction. So how confident and supported are leaders feeling as a result of the leadership training that they might have had? And there could be some reports of stress or time taken away from work for stress. So it's hopefully a metric you don't get to have to see, but it can exist in organisations. So that might be one that the needle needs to change on. And of course, it's only from speaking to the leadership teams and the HR teams that you would find out which metrics might be the right things to go for. At micro level, then it could be that you want to find out the answers to reflective questions. So rather than making the training around this something that you do to people, instead involving them and finding out their answers. There could be some common themes in what they're struggling with around delegation, or some specific help that they need. Completion rates and confidence scores might also come into play here. So confidence scores could be like before they've done the learning, how are they feeling around delegation and enabling their team to do more of those jobs, versus after the training. And again, completion rates can have a part here because probably if you're doing a program like this at leadership level, you'd roll it out with a pilot group and you see what difference it would make for those who've completed the training to those who didn't, against those major metrics that you might have looked at a kind of macro level. So that's just some thoughts around that. And we're going to dive in a little bit more now into the micro data. So let's put a little line under the sand around the macro and move into this section. So, Will, do you want to talk about what we've got on this first one here?
Yeah, I was going to say, so we'll take a little bit of a look at what the analytics feature in Elucidat offers in relation to that impact measurement. And we're aware that some of you may not have analytics enabled in your account, or maybe just haven't had a chance to kind of delve into it. So we're not going to go too much into the technical detail, but this should give you a real flavor for the information and the insights that you can derive from this part of the platform. So within analytics, there are 4 key areas, and the first of these is trends, which is the one on the slide now. So I'm not going to talk about the authoring time because it's not really relevant here, so that's the last one. But starting with activity by day, this gives you a really good breakdown showing the total number of learners who have accessed the course, completed the course, passed the course, and failed the course. So you can see some really interesting things here, like the ratio of learners who have passed versus those who have failed. And also, I think the activity spikes are really interesting here because they can give you some clues relating to like times of year, for example, that training will be better received. So if you launch some training and nobody does it for a month and then there's a sudden spike, that probably means there's either a deadline they have to complete it by, or maybe you're out of a particularly busy time in the business where people are more open to spending their time learning. So that could inform launch dates in future. The next one is completion rate. So we've spoken about this quite a bit and saying it's not a really strong indicator. But I think the question you have to ask yourself is, do completion rates really matter to your project? So if it's a piece of linear compliance training, then the answer is probably yes. But if you think of kind of reference tools that you might have created where people can dip in and out at the point of need, then actually completion of all of that content isn't important. What's most important there is access. So actually people being able to get what they need when they need it. And then finally is the total learner count. So thinking with the end in mind, like we were talking about before, this number is very much kind of dictated by what you were targeting here. So we've got 76,000 people have completed this course, which sounds very impressive. But, you know, if the target number was 150,000, then that begins to look less impressive. Whereas if it was, say, mandatory for 30,000 learners, this number would be amazing because you'd say, okay, well, we know that 30,000 people there or thereabouts have completed it because they had to, but then another 45,000 have actually chosen to complete this, which shows you that this course is obviously of great value to your population.
Yeah, brilliant. And yeah, if you've got thoughts about what sorts of things you could read into this data as well, then by all means use the chat as we go through. I'm going to keep going because time isn't always on our side with the webinars, and we've got a few more of these analytics data pages to go through. So this one shows you how your learners have answered questions. And in particular, I think of interest is, well, in Elucidat, one of our favourite features is using social polls. So polls, as shown on the top right, can be a great intervention to use in your learning, especially up front, to kind of gauge where everybody's at. So you can then go into your analytics and see, for example, if you're doing leadership training around delegation, like we talked about that confidence, you know, but what is it that they maybe do feel confident about or don't feel confident about? And maybe you've given them some options. So you could run some polls and sort of see where leadership teams are at with in relation to that. And you might do that first and then decide to go further with your training based on the results of that. But whether they're part of the kind of a bigger piece of learning or done up front, they can give you some really, really good results. You can understand about beliefs. You can understand what people are struggling with a bit more. You might also want to look at which questions that you've got in your e-learning that people are struggling with. So are there some tricky questions that people are getting stuck with? Equally, are there some easy questions that you expected people to kind of maybe not get right first time, but they are smashing it every time with 100%? Do you need to make it harder? You know, so actually looking into the questions can be a great way to work out if you've kind of pitched the learning at the right level. And of course, you can also use polls and questions at the end of your course to ask people to rate it. So are they generally happy with it? We talked about that NPS score, particularly important for things like onboarding. But actually, we believe it is often part and parcel of most digital learning that you should be putting out there. What do people think? Get the results and have a look at them in a page like this.
So this is the page progress tab, which allows you to see how learners have progressed through your course on a page by page basis. It's really great for building understanding around the kind of general engagement, so where learner engagement is higher or lower throughout a particular course. So what pages are you seeing where the total number of users has actually dropped off quite a bit, and why might this be? You know, it could be page errors, less relevant content, navigation or UX issues, so confusion caused by that actual kind of learner journey. Or it might simply be that by this point in a course, people feel like they've got the key messages, so they drop off because they think, actually, I've got it now. I don't need any more information in this area. And that could be a sign to you to say, actually, we could probably kind of truncate this course quite a bit, save on seat time, but still have the same impact. And it's also really important for understanding where people's interest lies. So going back to my example before of like a kind of resource-based course where people are just dipping in and out at the point of need, you know, if one of the pages has got 80% of the views, you know that that area is either somewhere where people feel less confident or it's a real recurring need for people. So it's something that maybe you could think about putting more focus on in your future kind of content strategy.
Brilliant, thanks. And this final page from Elucidat is called Your Data, and it allows you to drill into much more detail about how individual learners have answered questions. And in particular, if you've used open input questions in your learning, then this is where those answers will show. So where can that be really useful? Well, it kind of depends what learning you're doing and at what scale. But if you're doing a pilot or running it with a test group at the beginning, you might want to drill in and see what they have asked for in addition to this, like what are their thoughts on what else they need. You might want to drill into how they've answered questions because it's very telling for where you go next, for example. So there's loads and loads of detail in here. I think it depends on, you have to have in mind what you're trying to do in the big picture as to how useful this will be and how you're going to use it. But of course you can download it into a CSV, and then you can kind of look at that against your macro data, for example, like did this group of learners, did they all agree with this? And for example, and did we see their performance improve as a result, for example? So you can kind of draw some correlations. There's lots in that section. So we've got a bit of a case study, Will, haven't we, for how you might wrap this together with that delegation example in mind.
Yeah, so I suppose it's just thinking about what does this actually look like as an end-to-end process. And this flowchart shows this at a very high level. But if we imagine that scenario where an organization is seeing high levels of time taken off due to stress among its managers, so they establish a goal to reduce this time off via more effective delegation, essentially. So how can we reduce the stress by helping managers to rely on their teams more? So the first step would be to kind of benchmark. So how much time are people taking off at the moment in this cohort due to this reason? And then it would be a case of working on a design approach that would enable them to gather information and analyze that data in future. So this would include asking learners to specify their team and role, because then that would enable them to segment the data in future. But also having like reflective questions in there, which enable them to gather more insights around these issues as well, rather than just being prescriptive. So in order to measure that impact, the team's going to track that macro data around whether the time taken off due to stress reduces over time, and then also review that other data that we get from the reflective questions. So like I say, kind of building that understanding, and then you can use that information to inform your strategy going forward. Like we say, very high level example here, but I think it shows how we go from that, taking that business goal at the beginning, right through to actually being able to implement something, roll something out, and then look at the outputs from that to help define your way forward in the future.
Yeah, brilliant. And I think we've wrapped that up here, which I'm not going to dwell on too much, but of course you need to use it up front, as Will just said. Once you've got something live, you're going to get some data in and use that to be iterative, and then use it to take the project forward. And then look at the data after a certain time period of when you've got a certain number of learners through that piece of e-learning, for example, to then see how it might tie to that macro data that you pinned down at the beginning. So we've got a few minutes left. I think that we've got a question to throw out to you, and then we'll try and wrap up.
I was just replying in the chat there. So yeah, just a question for you guys to reflect on really before we finish. So what metrics are you now going to track following today's session, and why? So essentially, has this session helped you to kind of reframe your thinking around impact measurement for your own projects? And is there anything you're going to be doing differently going forward? Or is there anything that you were already excited about doing in the coming months that you want to share?
Let's
Yeah,
measure
do you want to figure out how to measure time to productivity? That's a really great one.
Yeah, time to first task is an interesting one. Maybe we can do a session sometime on onboarding, which often that's related to. So that would be a good one to dive into.
Yeah, and then Victoria also calling out, that kind of page by page view. So looking at interactions with different learning pages. Obviously, yeah, it's not going to be right for every project, but certainly for some projects, it's going to be really valuable information.
Oh, brilliant. If more of you have got other ideas, then please do carry on. We're going to just move forward with the webinar as we wrap up the last couple of minutes. So Will, this is your team. Why don't you talk about this slide?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it's been really great hearing all of your thoughts and kind of examples in the chat today. But if you've got a sense that you're not quite achieving the desired impact all the time, or you're not able to utilize the data that you have at your disposal effectively, then the Learning Consultancy team can certainly help you with that. So just encourage you to reach out to me directly if you've got any questions about how we can support you in this area. We'd love to kind of learn more about what you're doing with data and understand how we could support you in doing even more.
Brilliant, thank you. And of course, what will come next is you will get sent an email with some tips and a link to the recording of this webinar. after this has happened. We have also put up a new measurement and evaluation blog post, which I'll link to from the email that we send out. And of course, we have more Design Tip Tuesdays lined up. So the next one we're going to be diving into is around compliance. Everyone's tricky topic, maybe, the elephant in the room for most e-learning designers. But actually, we're going to look at an interesting slant around the kind of ethics and value-based compliance, where there's lots of grey areas. So actually, the data around that is interesting. Yeah, so that's what's coming up next, and we'll be in touch with the details in the next 24 hours. Just want to end with a massive thank you to you all. Thanks for participating, and we know we kind of showed lots of different data today, so lots to take in, but we'll share this back out with you tomorrow.
Thanks very much, everyone. Goodbye.
Brilliant. Bye.